Hey, Martin Popoff here, back again. We're going to be doing Overkill Rewind today. This is the show where you send in your votes and we pick the top 5 albums of a specific year. If you want to see us continue to do this, please subscribe and also consider donating to our Patreon. This time we're going back to 1984. Personal memories, I was at University of Victoria. I was in 3rd, 4th year, English. Great time to be into metal. You know, we had A&B Sound there. We'd go out to the clubs all the time. I remember hanging out with Kurt from Witchkiller. They were a cool band on Metal Blade. They had an EP out. Cover bands were big into Motley Crue at that time, but I remember also seeing Kick-Axe a couple times, one of my favorite Canadian bands of all time from Saskatchewan. They had an album in 1984. And also Whitesnake and Quiet Riot. Obviously, this was post-new wave of British heavy metal, but this is when hair metal and basically all things metal were kicking off at that time. So in heavy metal in 1984, there was some news. Deep Purple reconvened and put out the classic Perfect Strangers album, effectively killing off Black Sabbath with Ian Gillan and killing off Rainbow. Razzle, unfortunately, the Hanoi Rocks drummer, was killed in a car accident. Rick Allen, from Def Leppard, lost an arm in his car accident on New Year's Eve. Doom metal kicks off in a nice way. Doom metal kind of existed before, but we have Trouble and Saint Vitus issuing albums for the first time. Iron Maiden starts their World Slavery Tour in support of Powerslave, one of the most epic tours of all time. So yeah, lots of stuff going on in heavy metal in 1984. So yeah, let's get into the top 5. This is the top 5 heavy metal albums of 1984 as chosen by you. So number 5 of the 5 is Dio, The Last in Line. Great album. So Ronnie James Dio, obviously, there's the big dust-up breakup with Black Sabbath after a couple studio albums and the Live Evil album. And he's got a great debut in Holy Diver. And now we're on to his second album, The Last in Line. I love this record. I mean, to me, it's my favorite Dio album, tied with Dream Evil. That's a bit of a controversial choice. People generally think this is a classic. It hit number 23 on Billboard. It's a platinum album. How it was received at the time, kind of interesting. I mean, basically, Ronnie was really kicking ass. He was starting to play bigger venues all the time. He was a sensation. Essentially, this was a really cool band. You had Vinny Appice on drums, Jimmy Bain on bass, so you had a couple of veterans there. Jimmy brought a lot of cool rhythmic trademark ideas to the band. Viv Campbell on guitar. You know, he went on to Def Leppard. There was a short stint in Whitesnake, but his stuff that he played with Dio was exemplary. I mean, he had a cool rhythmic style of playing his licks and his solos. And of course, Ronnie with his great lyrics. The Last in Line is on here, Eat Your Heart Out. Mystery, nah, not so great. But I Speed at Night, incredible song. There was a lot of excitement around Ronnie, a lot of excitement around this band, a little bit of that satanic excitement because of Murray, you know, their demonic guy on the cover there. Absolutely, these guys were considered, you know, one of the top up-and-coming bands at that time. So yeah, in terms of a skull rating, I am going to give this 5 out of 5 skulls. So yes, moving on to number 4, Judas Priest, Defenders of the Faith, out on Columbia. What we have happening with Judas Priest, they're riding high. They hit the big time with British Steel back in 1980. Then they had a bit of a sideways slew with Point of Entry. Screaming for Vengeance in 82 was huge. This album was huge as well. The sort of narrative around this record was that, okay, so Screaming for Vengeance was the yellow album cover. This was the dark, you know, black album cover. Basically, you had an album that was considered to be a little darker and a little heavier than even Screamin' for Vengeance, which was a return. So people loved it. You know, Priest was basically an established arena act at this time. The album got to number 18 on Billboard. It's a platinum selling album. What do I think of Defenders of the Faith? I've had a lot of arguments lately about this album with people. I was playing it in the car a couple months ago, and I was horrified at the production of it. I almost think the drumming and the production around the drums and the bass is even worse than Turbo or even Ram It Down, where it's essentially all electronic drums. I think the drums actually sound better on Ram It Down. Very 80s and dated, and a lot of reverb and echo, just not a lot of proper bass, and the drums are very mechanistic on it. But it's got some great songs on it. Freewheel Burnin', Eat Me Alive. I think it holds together better as a heavy album, as a heavy metal album than Screaming for Vengeance. The main difference of what I feel now versus then is that the production is so bad that I find it almost unlistenable. So I'm going to give Defenders of the Faith 3.5 out of 5 skulls. So moving on to number 3, we have a cool, underground, obscure choice. So this is very cool. Merciful Fate, Don't Break the Oath, out on Roadrunner. In Canada, it came out on Attic. I remember getting it that way. What's the deal? Danish band, one of the first, overtly satanic bands in heavy metal, leading off from Venom, arguably Bathory as well, but I mean, Merciful Fate's even earlier. This is their second record. It's the yellow one. I know we just talked about yellow and black with Judas Priest, but we have a yellow album here for their second album. We had a black album for their first album, Melissa. What a cool band, an amazing band. At the time, how was it received? It was completely ignored. I mean, people really did not know this band, didn't care about this band. It was one for the underground people. But it had problems, right? I mean, King Diamond is an acquired taste. A lot of people just turn right off with his falsetto vocal situation. He has a number of different cool vocal things he does, but I can understand. I remember the band Zebra kind of felt that way. People feel that way about Rush, but of course, Geddy doesn't use a falsetto. He just has this inhumanly high, screechy, high voice when he wants to use it. But King uses an actual falsetto. Satanic band, progressive band, interesting band, but no one was really into it at the time. It got nowhere near gold in the States, but just a very cool album. I'm going to give this record 4 out of 5 skulls. I find the production a little bit harsh and screechy. I'm more than on the fence about the falsetto. I'm fine with it, but I'll throw in a little deduction there as well. So there you go. Merciful Fate, Don't Break the Oath. So moving up, here we go. We're at number 2. What will be number 1? Here we go. The top 2 of 1984 as chosen by you. We have Powerslave by Iron Maiden out on EMI Capitol. How was it received at the time? Iron Maiden was absolutely the darlings of heavy metal in terms of a young band. They're coming up. They're doing great. They were already doing great all the way back to Killers. They were doing even better when Bruce joined the band. Number of the Beast was a huge album. Peace of Mind was a huge album. Peace of Mind is my favorite Iron Maiden album. This comes out, it's a platinum album. It did great. Iron Maiden is on the tongues and lips of every Iron Maiden, or every heavy metal fan. Everybody loved Maiden at the time. Dio, can be construed to be a young band as well. Even Ozzy Osbourne can be construed to be a young band, but, obviously it's a little more problematic. Iron Maiden is truly a young band. I mean, they just basically came on the scene 1980 with their debut album, although Steve paid a lot of dues going all the way back to about 1974. But basically, Iron Maiden are our first bona fide, pure, proper heavy metal band that's doing really well in the 80s. What did I think of it? I mean, it came out, I loved it, it was cool, but I had a little bit of that, this is kind of Peace of Mind Part 2. And it definitely was that way. This is the first time ever that you had 2 Iron Maiden albums that sounded kind of quite similar to each other. You had Nico in there as a drummer. He has a lot of a trademark sound. I'm actually in the middle of my 3rd Iron Maiden book right now. It's just gone to print. Looking at old interviews, and I found some kind of interesting stuff, the way they framed it at the time. They thought Peace of Mind was a little bit staid and a little bit too calm. Essentially, they were saying this is much more of a rock and roll album, and that's actually true. It's kind of more up-tempo, it's a little bit loose, a little more ragged, so it has that going for it. It has this energy, but I find it's just too similar. There's a few songs that feel like filler on it, and of course, I mean, this is the album that kicked off the World Slavery Tour, which resulted in Live After Death, just this monumental tour. So, great album, but I still think Peace of Mind's a little bit better of an album, and I would even pick Killers as my second favorite. Iron Maiden, Powerslave, you know what? I think I'll go 4 out of 5 skulls on this one. Okay, so we're up to number 1. The number 1 greatest album of 1984 as chosen by you, Metallica, Ride the Lightning. Very cool choice. This is their second record. Huge leaps and bounds over Kill 'Em All. They go to Denmark. They record with Flemming Rasmussen, who gives them an amazing, amazing production sound on this. It's such a killer record in terms of crushing bass sound, but it's also kind of dry. They're on the ascendant. This came out on Megaforce in the States, but they were quickly signed to Elektra, so they were basically a major label band very, very quickly. But yeah, credit to Marcia and Johnny Zazula for nurturing Metallica. I remember, one of my fondest memories is coming back from Spokane, Washington with my, UK copy of this, and at the same time, Sabotage Sirens and Savage, Loose, and Lethal, the 3 Blue albums. They were all incredible, but they were all very different. Savage was the waning years of the new wave of British heavy metal. Savatage was this very traditional, almost metal churchy, very, very cool heavy metal, but very traditional. Metallica was doing something brand new, and boy, was this brand new. I mean, this was way more brand new than even Kill 'Em All was, because you had, very proggy and fast tracks like Fight Fire with Fire and Ride the Lightning. You had them really slow down For Whom the Bell Tolls. You had the dark ballad, Fade to Black. You had a cool long instrumental on here. Just a lot of cool variety. How was it received at the time? The insiders basically loved this record. Metallica was probably the coolest, most cutting-edge, front-edge band. All metalheads considered this just a raging masterpiece, except for, there are small pockets in LA, the guys that kind of grew up with the guys the really tight metal scene down there actually considered the album to be a little bit of a sellout, because it was almost too slick and too much cool variety and too away from thrash, even though thrash isn't even really invented yet at this point. It's still very brand new. So essentially they were considered by the metalheads to be probably the best and most exciting band that we had at the time. Now, did anybody think they were going to be as huge as they became? Absolutely not. I mean, this was very, very extreme music with a very extreme recording, an extreme vocal. Remember, thrash vocals are brand new. James is doing kind of this barking thing. It's not as bad as a death metal vocal, but there's a lot of vocal fry in what he's doing. So nobody thought Metallica was going to be massive, massive, massive. The dreams were like, oh, could this band be gold? Could they play hockey arenas, if you packaged them together? And, incredible how big they did become. And it's gone on to be a 6 times platinum album, but that's completely at odds with how it went, because it was a slow burn. I mean, they kind of just slowly rose, slowly with some excitement through And Justice for All, and then into the huge album, the Black Album, which is Over Diamond, of course. So yeah, not a huge album at the time, but on its way, 6 times platinum. Metallica, Ride the Lightning, absolutely, you got to give this 5 out of 5 skulls. So yeah, honorable mentions, bubbling under. What do we have? We have Celtic Frost with Morbid Tales. That's another very cool underground choice in extreme metal. Again, it was pretty much ignored at the time. People listened to it. People were probably pretty horrified with the sound of it. You have Queensryche, The Warning. That also got a lot of votes. And that's great, because this is their debut album. It's recorded in England. The band doesn't like it very much, but it does have some classics on it. The recording was kind of weird, but it's cool. I mean, this is a band essentially, the first band that is reinventing progressive metal after Rush invented progressive metal. We have Bathory with their self-titled debut, another totally extreme choice, as extreme as you can get, really. This is more extreme than Venom, more extreme than Celtic Frost, but a very important album in the history of extreme metal. They were a very satanic band for a while, then Quorthon went more to kind of a Viking theme. Made a lot of records. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But yeah, an important album at the time. Metal Church, so their debut album. Not quite a thrash band. They're a Seattle band. The title track has a riff that I often call the greatest riff of all time. But they're more of they mix a little bit of thrash with a little bit of speed metal, with a little bit of more traditional metal. They were always like that right through their career. Just a very cool band. David Wayne, the singer, is no longer with us. Kurt Vanderhoof is a genius. He had later Presto Ballet and stuff. Just like a real musicologist dude. He's still doing Metal Church, which is very cool. So this album was almost like Metallica. It came out as an indie, and then they got signed. But they never made it very big, but yeah. And yes, Manowar, Hail to England, which is my favorite Manowar album. I remember getting this on import at Lyle's place in Victoria, and people being totally into this band. I thought the first album was kind of junky and weird sounding. The second album is a little obscure, but this, they blew the doors wide open. It's got a lot of personality to it. Most people I know had an English copy of this. It's called Hail to England because England, embraced the band way more than America. So very cool. And just wanted to mention a few. This is where I get to say what my picks would have been. My picks mostly would have been what got chosen. And yes, great list of 5. Great honorable mentions. We have very, very smart viewers. This is just a very cool list. But just a couple things I wanted to name check. Black and Blue. A lot of people don't talk about them, but they were like the Baby Twisted Sister. They were like just a cool hair band, but they were actually quite heavy. A little bit like Rat. Very cool heavy band. Chateau Firepower I thought was a very cool post-new wave of British heavy metal album, arguably new wave of British heavy metal, ends in 1984. We had a Gravedigger heavy metal breakdown, great killer German thrashy album with Chris Boltondahl. Kick-Axe Vices, to pick a Canadian one, love the sound of that album, just a cool Pasha Quiet Riot sound to what they were doing. Great lead singer with a lot of magnetism in George Christon, but just kind of like a cool, heavy, helixy, old school hair metal kind of album. Just a masterpiece. Check it out. Overdrive Swords and Axes. Samson, Don't Get Mad, Get Even. Thought that was cool. Samson was a cool band even after Bruce Dickinson. And then finally, Trouble, Psalm 9. It was called Trouble at the time. Basically the start of Doom on Metal Blade. Brian Slagle loved those guys. He had great taste. So there you go. Thanks again for visiting with us. That was the top 5 heavy metal albums of 1984. Again, don't forget to subscribe. Consider contributing to our Patreon. And thanks again for sending in just a killer list. You guys are very smart. I love seeing these results compiled. We'll see you again next time.